All right. So, again, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I am very excited to introduce our speaker today. Cheyenne Graham is one of the GBatNet student representatives, and so she's been working with the GBatNet now for, I guess, about a year and a half or so. And she'll be speaking to us today about one of her study topics, an introduction to crash course into hybridization. And so, without further ado, I would like to pass the controls off to Cheyenne.
Thank you, Dana. Okay, let me know if you can see my screen and everything's working. Is this working?
Yep. It just needs to be a presenter view.
Great.
Awesome.
There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dana, for the introduction and for having me come and speak about hybridization. So like Dana said, my name is Cheyenne Graham, and we're gonna get started. Okay, never mind. Now there we go. So my name again is Cheyenne. I am currently a third year PhD student at the University of Michigan, but I'm gonna get started by talking about what I've done in my master's just briefly. But I started off working with primates, howler monkeys specifically, and their interaction with pinworms. And now currently still at University of Michigan, I am in the Speer and Duffy labs. And now I'm working with bats and also rats. And I have Penn State here. I didn't mention this, but that's where I did my undergrad. And before I just hop into what is hybridization, I just want everyone to know that throughout this talk, there's a little bit of animal bias and mainly mammal bias, but that's because, again, I study bats and I studied primates and also some rats. And so throughout this talk, you're going to hear me talk about animal hybridization this and animal hybridization that. But in actuality, animals hybridizing, the taxa hybridizing, it's kind of rare and less common that we see in research compared to plants. And you might know Gregor Mendel, who did this with pea plants and watched them or set up a trial for them to hybridize. And so hybridization in plants is more common and more studied. So, what is hybridization? And when we think about hybridization, you might think about certain examples like the mule, which is a hybrid between our lovely horses and also donkeys. But you also might think of the examples like a liger, which is a cross between lions and tigers, but also one that I recently learned about, which is the common garden strawberry, which is also a hybrid as well. And I'm going to walk you through this process of what hybridization is and how this occurs between two different species, but I'm going to give you some definitions first. So, you're going to hear me talk about populations, which is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same place at the same time. Genes, which are segments of DNA that contains instructions to make specific traits or functions. A gene pool, which is collection of these genes within a species. Gene flow, which is the movement of genes between populations. And above here, I just have these two bat species. We're going to say species one is one population and species two is another population. And when these two species come into contact, they mate. So right here, the circles are going to represent species boundaries, so the population borders. So this circle here is for species one, the other circle is species two. And when I'm talking about these two species coming into contact with each other, what's formed is this hybrid zone. And the hybrid zone is a geographic location in which these species boundaries overlap and hybridization occurs. So we have these two distinct species. And when they're hybridizing, when they're mating, they produce what's called a hybrid. This is their offspring. And hybrids are individuals of mixed ancestry. So the ancestry from species one and species two combine to create this hybrid. But oftentimes, sometimes, not always, a process called introgression occurs in which the hybrid will backcross and mate with either or parental population, which are species one or species two. And introgression can be a bit confusing sometimes. So I have this diagram here that I'm going to walk through what introgression is and how it comes about. So we're going to say hypothetically, this red circle is our population one for one species, and this blue circle is species two, a different population. And they're in this scenario, they're mating. They create an F1 hybrid, and your F1 hybrids are your first generation offspring. And usually the hybrids in the F1 population are 50% of the red species and 50% of the blue species. But then let's say that they backcross with just the red population. They would then produce F2 hybrids, and these hybrids would be like 75% of the red species and like 25% of the blue species. And then let's say that these F2 hybrids will backcross again with the red population. You would then have your third generation hybrids, in which they now look like 90% of the red population and less like the blue population. And for our blue species, this can actually be bad. So, when I'm talking about this being bad for the blue species, we have to think about this in a conservation aspect. So, if our red population is dominating by mating with the F1 hybrids F2 and F3, the population will begin to look more like the red species and less like the blue species. And so, I'm going to explain that a bit here. So let's say that the blue species is native. So this species population is endemic to this area. The red population is invasive, meaning they were either brought over or they're just in this new habitat that they never originated from. And before sorry. So we also have this gene pool that I mentioned before, which again is just a collection of all your genes. This gene pool, as we see here, is dominated by just the red population's genes. And so what this is called is genetic swamping. And this is when you have repeated hybridization and backcrossing, which then causes the gene pool of one population, like the blue population, to be overwhelmed by the red species. And we're going to come back to this. So in summary, or simply put, hybridization is when you have two distinct species that mate, they exchange genes, and then they reproduce. But there's a lot more about hybridization. Okay, so here I just want to talk about reproductive barriers that might inhibit hybridization from being successful or coming about. And one of those is prezygotic isolation. So before the zygote is created, and these are barriers that prevent fertilization from occurring. And this could be, whoops, there you go, like different mating calls. So for example, we have one frog species, and this frog species is trying to put out a mate call to reach another individual, like a female. And another species hears this mating call but doesn't know what he's saying. So the mating call is a barrier that would block them from being able to reproduce. We also have habitat isolation. So let's say, for example, we have these two porcupine populations that are physically separated by like this geographic barrier. For instance, in this case would be like this river. And so this barrier is not allowing the two populations to come into contact, so therefore reproduction cannot occur. And just briefly, we could also have a prezygotic isolation like temporal isolation. So perhaps the breeding times of these species does not overlap. And they could also have incompatible reproductive organs that are, again, like just do not match and allow for breeding to occur. So there's another form of reproductive isolation, and that is called postzygotic isolation, in which these are barriers that occur after fertilization. And so when this occurs, we're saying that there are hybrids, but you could have hybrid inviability. And in this case, this is when individuals, hybrid individuals, do not survive past fertilization. And then more commonly, we have hybrid sterility. And these are hybrid individuals that do not have the ability to reproduce. And I mentioned the example of mules before, and mules are a common case of hybrid sterility in which they're not able to reproduce at all. So what happens if hybridization is successful? There's no hybrid sterility, there's no hybrid inviability. We could have what's called hybrid vigor, and this is when hybrid individuals will exhibit improved traits compared to the parentals that maybe these parental populations, these species cannot exhibit these traits. We also have adaptive introgression, and this is when beneficial alleles, and alleles are variants of genes from one species that gets introduced into another species gene pool. And then less commonly, we could have hybrid speciation in which the hybrids form their own distinct species. So I'm going to focus on hybrid vigor for a second here. And again, this is when these individuals are exhibiting improved traits. And one of my favorite studies is about this endangered parakeet species in which the authors looked into how their immunity might be more enhanced compared to the parentals. And we have here, just want to show you the pictures. So on the top left, this is our Forbes parakeet. This was the endangered species. And on the bottom right is the red-crowned parakeet, which was the non-endangered species. And these are our two parental populations that formed two types of hybrids. Here is our slight distinct hybrid, meaning that this hybrid is more similar to our Forbes hybrid or Forbes parakeet. And this hybrid here is a distinct hybrid, meaning it was 50-50% of each of the parental populations. And what they saw through this cross was that hybrids exhibited higher measures of immunity, and they were able to ward off disease infection that the endangered bird species could not. Okay, so a second form of the successful hybridization, I want to get into adaptation. And adaptation is a trait or a change that helps an organism survive and also reproduce in its environment. So I have another hypothetical, and we're going to look here at the Arctic tundra and this glacier. And we're going to say that there's a population of these squirrels. And these squirrels are well adapted to very cold climates. They have no problem with it. But then let's say like climate change, for this case, we're just gonna say it's a really hot sun, comes in, starts melting all the glaciers, and these squirrels are not able to adapt to this changing temperature, this changing climate. And so what we could see is that the population could start dwindling because not all species can adapt to certain changes, and adaptation also does not occur overnight. But let's bring in hybridization. And let's say we have another squirrel population come through because these squirrels are well adapted to warmer climates. And so they're able to move into this new environment because it's more fitting for them at this point. And let's say that this squirrel population that just arrived has a strong gene pool. And by strong, I just mean they're well adapted to a warmer climate. And then let's say they start mating with the Arctic squirrels that we have here, and they're exchanging genes. We could say that through this gene exchange, they're going to produce hybrids, and these hybrids are going to be able to adapt to the changing climate that the Arctic population is not able to because of the genes given and exchanged through the warmer climate squirrels. And then we could also say that these alleles, these genes that were introduced into this parental gene pool, the parental pool being our Arctic squirrels here, will then be able to allow the parentals to adapt. And this is called adaptive introgression. So through these different examples, I just want to highlight why does hybridization matter? And I've talked about adaptation, and there's various papers that talk about how hybridization can be the source of various adaptation to new environments, allowing for better immunity, and also just adapting to like parasitic infection, different climates, different temperatures, and also like pollution. But unfortunately, hybridization is not always great. There's not always benefits that come about. And so I'm going to briefly talk about some negative consequences of hybridization, in which we could have hybrids outcompeting parentals. And by this, I mean, let's say hybrids are produced, but then they're able to get resources much better than the parents are. Then they're able to outcompete these parents, and the parents' population might start dwindling. We also have genetic swamping that I mentioned before, in which case one species gene pool begins dominating the other. And lastly, we could have like the loss of local adaptations. So through adaptive introgression, the new genes being brought into the gene pool could allow adaptations from a one parental species to dwindle and decline. And I just want to highlight another study that's done on these marine fish. And so with this population of A. bucheri, they saw that when it started hybridizing with another species, the hybrids that were produced began to replace this population through genetic swamping. Okay, so I'm a little biased towards immunology, and I wanted to lastly have this section about hybridization and immunology. And immunology is the study of the immune system and also its function. And another term you'll hear me say, and probably heard me say already, was immunity. And immunity is the ability of an organism like ourselves to defend against pathogens like viruses, bacteria, and also parasites. So why does this matter in terms of hybridization and why would it matter in hybrids? Well, hybridization could introduce like new immune genes or combinations of different genes that allow hybrids to have like this hybrid vigor, allowing them to have stronger responses or a stronger immune system that maybe their parentals did not have. And again, highlighting this parakeet paper that I mentioned briefly, this one showed hybrid vigor in which the hybrids again had a stronger immune response versus the parentals. And then another common, not common, another paper I like is called Where Are the Wormy Mice, in which these researchers went to a hybrid zone, found these hybrids, looked to see if they had any worms, and found that they had none, but then saw that the parental populations were infected with these parasitic worms. And then, because I like bats a lot, I wanted to highlight this study, which is quite recent, in which they're looking at how Myotis bats, which have this viral tolerance, perhaps have this because of adaptive, or I'm sorry, ancestral introgression. So, I want to briefly talk about my research now that I'm bringing this paper about Myotis bats. And my research deals with this question that it's how does hybridization influence immunity in bats, but also rats? And for the bat portion, I'm looking at the Myotis bats, given that this paper that recently came out is saying that they have this ancestral introgression that could have swapped genes and kept the immune genes conserved throughout multiple Myotis species and allowing them to have such viral tolerance. And then in rats, I'm also looking at this in the genus Rattus. But specifically for Myotis, I want to know with this ancestral introgression, does this influence virus diversity? And with Rattus genus, I want to know that if there are hybrids, would there be greater immune gene variation and also less parasite diversity? And just for this talk, to keep it brief, I'll just focus really briefly on my chapter dealing with the Myotis bats, virus diversity, and hybridization. So why bats? And with why bats, why I chose this study system is one, they have this unique tolerance, so they're known to harbor various diseases, but not show any symptoms of being infected. They're long-lived, and they're also known to have cancer resistance. And so for my study system, again, are Myotis bats, but I'm also including Artibius bats, which are these fruit-eating bats here. And Myotis bats are known to be promiscuous, so they're known to just mate with almost anyone, but not all Myotis bats are promiscuous maters. Artibius bats are known to also be harem maters, so this means that there's one male that mates with multiple females. And with this, this brings about again that Foley paper, and they're showing that this mating behavior that the Myotis bats have probably influenced this history of ancestral introgression, and that this introgression could have introduced beneficial immune alleles. And with this, I am trying to determine that if these Myotis bats have this ancestral introgression, would this influence immune gene variation and viral tolerance in Myotis bats, and compare this to the immune system of Artibius bats, which lack a history of introgression. So my dissertation is very hybridization focused. And so in conclusion, hybridization is very complex. We have positive outcomes of hybridization that could generate adaptation, like hybrids being better suited for environments than parentals through hybrid vigor, having adaptive introgression as well. Or we could have negative outcomes, which could mean that this could threaten biodiversity through genetic swamping or loss of local adaptations within the parental populations. And that overall, if we understand hybridization, this could help us predict species survival, extinction risks, and also resilience throughout a changing world. And that's all I have. So thank you very much for coming to this talk, and thank you so much to GBatNet for allowing me to give this talk. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Cheyenne. Thanks. I like how you call it kind of like a crash course in hybridization because it definitely is. It's a great overview of the different topics of how we can look at hybridization and how it's related to. And I'm also biased towards the mammals, so towards mammal populations.
I'm
All
so
right,
biased.
no bias, none at all. So does anyone have any questions for Cheyenne, or comments or anything we would like to say to Cheyenne before we log off for the day?
Sorry it was so short, everyone.
And if you want to put questions in the chat, you can feel free to do that too. I'm also checking there.
Great work, Cheyenne. I want you to come and do this as a lecture in my classroom. So it's very clear.
Oh, thank you. I would love to.
Come on out to Colorado.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
All right, well, if we don't have any questions, we can go ahead and log off for the day. And again, if you want to use this information in the classroom, it will be available on the YouTube channel, or you can enlist Cheyenne to come out to your classroom because she is a very good science communicator. So we had a comment in the chat. Thank you so much for the amazing talk, great information, and you really made it understandable. So thank you, Cheyenne. You really did.
Much. Thank you. Oh, thanks, Josie Posey.
All right. Well, we will go ahead and wrap it up for today then. So again, thank you so much everyone for joining
Thank
the
you.
webinar this morning, and have a great rest of the day.